thank you for inviting me. Doreen is the one that dobbed me in for this, and she's not here. So, that's not very fair. It is nice to be here. It's my first time at an AIG talk, and nice to see some familiar faces as well. I'm just getting myself set up here. Okay. All right. I'm going to obviously talk about mine waste, tailings, and as Peter said, it's my job at Cobalt Blue to look globally for opportunities to reprocess sulfide-rich mine waste around the world, not just Australia. It's an area that I think has a huge opportunity, and I hope that you come away at the end of this talk with the same sense of that opportunity, but as well as a sense of some of the challenges, because it's not quite the same as developing a primary ore body. But a key thing is then considering the environmental outcomes as part of that opportunity as well. Little disclaimer. Seems very yellow. Anyway, this slide is not going to contain any new information for anybody in this room. We all know that the energy transition requires widespread adoption of cleaner technologies to generate and store electricity. However, these technologies are far more metals intensive than traditional energy generation and storage. And so you can see these graphs, which are from the International Energy Agency. So on the left-hand side, we've got electric cars versus a traditional combustion engine car. And then all of those colours, you might not be able to see the actual writing, but that's all the different metals that go into building that car. So a lot more metals than a normal car. And most of that is going to be the battery, of course. And then energy generation, we've got offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, nuclear, coal, and natural gas. So again, same thing. The amount of metals, and it's kilograms per something or other, required for green energy, we still need a lot more mining to do the same amount of energy generation. So how we do that: increased demand for metals, increased focus on mining, increased focus on the sustainability of mining, social practices, environmental standards, all of that kind of thing around the world that we have. How we meet these demands while satisfying all of those other aspects of societal expectations is really the challenge of today's mining industry. And not just mining industry, but mining and metal manufacturing industries. There is no doubt that we will need new mining, but I do think that we can be far more efficient with the mines that we already have, and either ones that are now abandoned or that are still operating. So this graph is from the ICMM, International Council on Mining and Metals. It was produced from the Tailings Reduction Roadmap in 2022, and it shows the breakdown of tailings volumes into 6 different commodity streams. So the main ones, there are a lot of others, obviously. There's way more things that we mine than those 6, but on this graph, we're just showing alumina. I'm going to use my right hand, I'm not left-handed. Alumina, gold, coal, iron ore, nickel, and copper. Copper is by far the largest producer of tailings by volume. So according to this study, and it is already a few years old, 3.4 billion tonnes of tailings was produced in 2019 from copper mines around the world, and that's copper mine only. You add into nickel, and we're up to about 5.5 billion tonnes for that year. The graph also shows that there's an increase with time. We're making more waste for the same amount of metal because of globally declining grades, particularly for those really big copper deposits, but weighing that against the increasing demand. So we need more metal We have to mine more and more material, even just to get the same amount of metal. So then to get more metal, it's kind of a runaway horse in a bit of a way. So we're just going to be making more and more waste. And of course, this graph shows 2018 as the last date there. You know, that's going to be a massive underestimate. More recent, I think the total of this graph is about 10 million tonnes, or 9.5 billion tonnes, sorry. The estimates now are up to about 13 billion tonnes per year of global tailings production. Now, I've put up here that it's an opportunity. It's a massive problem, managing all of that waste, but it is also an opportunity because as geologists, geochemists, maybe the odd geophysicist, we do know that there are other commodities mixed in with the original ore of these copper, nickel, gold, and other mines. In many cases, the coexisting metals, and in the case of nickel and copper, that might be cobalt, these coexisting metals were not of interest to the incumbent miner. So in decades past, they have ended up in the waste. So the idea, therefore, here is to reframe this huge environmental burden into an opportunity for green battery metal production and also other types of metal. I mean, when we're talking about mine waste, the sky's the limit, really, in terms of what's on the periodic table and what could be in that waste. So it doesn't have to be just battery metals. As an aside, the USGS estimates that for the top 10% of copper deposits that they have in their database, those top 10% of copper deposits contain a mean of 0.16% cobalt. And then for nickel deposits, the mean lies around 0.1%. So when you start to extrapolate that out to the volumes of ore that that has been mined as part of those deposits, we're talking about a lot of metal value that may have been tossed out with the garbage. Okay, just to reinforce this message, this is a series of graphs that was produced by Rick Valenta and his colleagues at the Sustainable Minerals Institute in Queensland here. And it's focusing particularly on the tailings from copper production. We're already producing a huge amount of tailings, and the decrease in grades and the increase in volume of waste that's produced is particularly profound for copper, more so than a lot of other deposits, because of the scale of those big low-grade ore bodies. So that situation is only going to get worse. And the grade, oh, hang on, let me get to my notes here. The grade gets lower. So you can see here on the top graph, this is the annual production in million tonnes. And then this is the grade. It's millhead grade and recovered grade. So two different ways of representing the same thing. So to produce the same amount of copper, we've got less and less grade, which translates then into this bottom graph, the amount of waste that has to get moved in order to make that same amount of metal. So by 2050, we're about here, 2024, and this is tailings, and then the lighter blue is non-tailings waste. So the other gang material that's been shifted and moved as part of the mining process. By the time we get to 2050, we're going to be filling up the same volume as Sydney Harbour every 25 days in terms of global production of copper mine tailings. That's quite a lot. Oh dear, here we go. So we're producing more and more waste, tens to hundreds of billions of tonnes of material, and all of that material comes with significant environmental burden. We have to pay to rehabilitate that waste, and then even once we've rehabilitated it, we may have to still pay very significant and long-term ongoing management costs of those waste facilities. If it's not managed properly, like hopefully we do here in Australia, but other places maybe don't have quite as strict regulations around management of waste, then those sites don't become a financial burden on a company, they become an environmental burden on local communities and ecosystems. I heard an estimate today actually for an old pyrite mine in South Australia that the ongoing water management for that site, which is on the burden of the South Australian government, it will be a requirement for the next 800 to 1,000 years. That's how long that site is going to be leaking acid. So unless some kind of action is taken to remove the material. Oops. Okay. So as an industry, we make more waste by volume than pretty much any other sector around the world. I haven't yet found, I tried to do a comparison of different industries, basically, in terms of global waste production. I haven't found one yet that tops mine waste. And it costs us a fortune to clean it up, and then in some cases to continue managing it for decades or centuries to come. This image, and it might be a bit hard to read, it's a dark slide, and I was warned dark slides wouldn't work once we got here. It shows environmental bonds held by the state governments around Australia, keeping in mind that many industry experts actually state that the costs of mine closure and full rehabilitation, not just mine closure, they're vastly underestimated against reality. So this is how much, we complain about having to pay our environmental bonds when we're developing a mine, operating a mine. But I think we're actually getting off pretty lightly. And then you put that into perspective of even in a country with strong environmental legislation and social responsibility, we still don't actually do mine closure very well. CRC Times stated in a report that they released in November last year that out of the tens of thousands of historical mine sites, and that does include some very small sites as well as bigger ones, but out of tens of thousands of historical sites in Australia, only 15, no zeros, just 15 have been fully rehabilitated. So that's a pretty poor reflection on our ability to take care of the sites that we operate post-closure. All right. But of course, we're here to talk about opportunity, not just make everybody feel bad. So it is a huge environmental burden, but it is also a big opportunity. And I mentioned it in the graph from, the volumes of mine waste and what other metals there might be in there. This little diagrammy thing shows metal associations with some of those primary commodities. So in the center, you've got what we might consider more traditional commodities for mine. So think of that as like the primary mine, and then going out from that are all of the associated metals, and the closer they are into that circle, the more strongly affiliated with that primary metal they are. So I should have sort of gone in and highlighted them, but copper and nickel are down here, and cobalt, because of course cobalt blue, we're interested in cobalt, but those are the ones that have strongest association with cobalt. So there's very, very little data on mine waste around the world. It's not something that's sort of publicly reported. We don't have great data sets available online like we do for pre-competitive exploration data, for example, or mandatory reporting of historical exploration once you move on from your tenure. So it's very hard to get good geochemical and mineralogical information about what is actually in a tailings. And when we're talking about things that were not part of the primary production, and there was no resource estimate for these commodities or for these metals, then there is no information about what's gone through the plant and what's come out the other side. So then we go, okay, well, where can I look around the world? And we don't need a wheel like this. We know this instinctively, you know, as geologists, that, well, base metals hang out together, you know. So if I want to go find some cobalt in mine waste, I'll look at the copper and nickel mines around the world. But I do think it's something worth thinking about because, you know, I'm going to just assume that most of the people in the room are more leaning on the kind of exploration geology type of bent. We know that there's all sorts of stuff in those rocks when we're out exploring for them. But once it goes, and I'm looking at you, Simon Tier, once it goes into a resource model and it's defined as this is a copper resource, or maybe it's, you know, if we're a bit adventurous, it's a copper gold resource, something like that, then it's in a block model, it's in a computer, this is what it is. We tend to forget that there's actually a whole heap of other valuable stuff. It's just that that's what the company was interested in and what they thought they could make money out of in the first place. We just haven't recorded all of that other information, but it's still there. All right, just to reinforce this is the little pie graph, copper and nickel. That's where we're going to, those are the things that have the strongest associations with cobalt. And then this is a picture of just a rock, you know, because it's made up of a lot of things, not just one or two minerals or metals. All right. So that was the global scene, how much we've got, what the opportunity is. In Australia in particular, we have a very active and a very proud mining history, and we have a very huge natural mineral endowment. Mining is, of course, a very significant part of our economy. This map is from Geoscience Australia. It's from the Atlas of Mine Waste portal. Shows the selection of mine waste sites for which GA has data thus far. And it is associated with some operating sites and some historical sites. And that's going to be a whole, it's not just tailings dams. Of course, it might be spent heap leach, it might be waste dumps, it could be a slag pile, it could be a range of different things. Some of them might have been rehabilitated, some of them might require ongoing environmental management. Whatever the case, the chances are that there is still significant metal and other raw material value remaining in these waste stockpiles. But this map only shows about 1,500 individual mine waste sites. We know that that's a massive underestimate. The number should be a lot larger than that. GA conservatively estimates that there are approximately 3,500 mine waste sites across all commodities across Australia. Whereas then I've said it before, CRC time described numbers closer to tens of thousands. So not only do we not have really good data on mine waste, the composition and makeup of it itself, we don't even know how much we've got. There's no good data on where it is in the first place. And once we know that it's there, how much is it? You know, what's the volume? How deep does it go? All that sort of thing. Similar map for Europe, just again showing global perspective. Europe, of course, has a much longer history than Australia. Well, it depends what you define as mining. I'm going to talk a bit more about conventional sort of mining or modern day mining, but history of modern mining of thousands of years, much more than other parts of the world. This map is from Geosurveys. They have an online platform which had some great data on it, but it shows clusters. So these circles show clusters of mines and then the numbers in the middle, which are small, but that shows how many individual site points there are within that cluster, because there are far too many to show them all on the map. So that's just the way they had displayed it. It shows operating and historical mines. And basically there's one dot in there, I think, that has 10,000 sites in it. It's up here somewhere in Scandinavia. Anyway, lots of opportunity, even in a place that's not what we think of when we think of let's go start a new mining operation. But there's certainly a lot there. So, United States, I really struggled to find a decent data set of mine sites in the US, even though the USGS is usually pretty good at this stuff. So this is, as far as this is overkill, but I think it's like every single thing that could possibly be associated with mining in any way, even if it's like minuscule. But nevertheless, there are a lot. And then Canada had slightly better data. So that's why I separated the North and South America, sorry, not North and South America, Canada and the United States, just because it was too yucky putting the two different data sets together. But anyway, a lot of mining in Canada as well, and a lot of opportunity. So global scene setting done. What is Cobalt Blue doing in this space? So because we're not a Queensland company, I'll give you a little bit of a background of who we are and what we do. So head office is down in Sydney. We have a cobaltian pyrite deposit in New South Wales, about 20 k's outside of Broken Hill. So on the right, that's the Broken Hill cobalt deposit. And then we're also developing a cobalt nickel sulfate refinery in Western Australia. The third pillar, which is where I come in, is to develop, as I said at the start of the talk, to develop additional sites for Cobalt Blue around the world through the reprocessing of mine waste. I'm not going to talk specifically about Broken Hill or the refinery today, but the concept of mine, remine and refine is integral to how the company is evolving and where we're going in future. And I think I personally like it because I think it makes sense to build a company, even a junior company, around sort of multiple parts of the mining value chain. Cobalt Blue flow sheet. Quick disclaimer, my background is exploration geology, not metallurgy. So the explanation you're going to get here is going to be very simplistic, like the diagram, but if you do have any complex questions, I can take them on notice and share them with our metallurgists and get back to you. So this flow sheet was developed for the Broken Hill Cobalt Project, which is a pyrite ore body with cobalt in the pyrite. It's a very simple mineralogy and doesn't contain a lot of other stuff. But this flow sheet does lend itself to a waste remining application because of the strong focus on that sulfide mineralogy, particularly pyrite, which is a low value sulfide, and it tends to be separated out when people are chasing, chalcopyrite or sphalerite or other things. And so the pyrite is one of those minerals that does end up being concentrated in tailings dams. So this flow sheet has been sort of modified a little bit to apply to a mine waste scenario. So we're going to have sulfide waste generated from some source. It doesn't have to be open pit. It can be underground as well, obviously, just mine waste. We probably don't need to crush it because it's already crushed. But we do need to make a pyrite or sulfite concentrate. So at Broken Hill, that's done through gravity, but elsewhere, depending on the mix of different sulfides and stuff, we might look at flotation, whatever. That's kind of not that key. Once we've got so looking at pyrite specifically, because it's the nasty one that people don't like to process, we've got our pyrite concentrate, we run it through a kiln, we turn it into pyrrhotite. So we're calcining it at this point because pyrrhotite has slightly less sulfur than pyrite. We are making elemental sulfur the kiln is run under a nitrogen atmosphere, and we get a sulfur off gas. during conversion of pyrite to pyrrhotite, and we capture that gas and we cool it down and turn it into elemental sulfur, which is, I'm going to say this over and over again during the talk, elemental sulfur is not reactive in the environment. It is a safe and benign product. So then we've made pyrrhotite concentrate, and then we put it into a series of leach steps. It's pressure oxide leach. From that, again, we make a hematite leach residue because it's under oxygen. We want to oxidize it not into jarosite or goethite, which are both nasty things in the environment as well. We make hematite, which is nice and stable. And then we also make more elemental sulfur at this leach step. We get our leach products and I'll show you on the next slide, we make a mixed hydroxide precipitate, which is what we do at Broken Hill. For other deposits, we've got a different chemistry. We can make other things, and then for the Broken Hill products, they would then be sent to the refinery. But the key here is it doesn't have to be just pyrite. If there's no pyrite, if it's pyrrhotite, then we skip the calcine step and we go straight to the leach. If it's other sulfides, again, we don't have to worry about that whole pyrite business. We can just go to the oxide leach. So I like this picture because it's very colourful. So our products are, for a start, nice yellow elemental sulfur. This sulfur has been prilled, so turned into like little tiny balls, which then makes it safe for transport, for storage, and anytime you're moving elemental sulfur around, it's in a prilled form. The metal bearing product of the main part of the processing plant is then the MHP, mixed hydroxide precipitate. For Broken Hill, that would be then a cobalt and nickel hydroxides. Those would then go to Perth and we make a nickel sulfate and a cobalt sulfate. And the reason we're doing that is because having it in the sulfate form is then a little bit further down the supply chain into the EV battery market. Whereas most nickel mines in Australia stop at this point here and then sell it on to, they sell it as MHP to the next person. So again, if we're not talking about Broken Hill, if we're talking about some other scenario with no cobalt whatsoever, with a bunch of other sulfide minerals, with copper, with silver, with all sorts of, we just tailor that back end to be able to extract what we want and what we're targeting out of that leach solution. Some examples. So we've run test work on dozens of sites around the world, but the majority of that work is not public, so I can't talk about it here. This is an example that I don't know if anyone in this room, maybe a couple of you have seen me talk about it before. But if you've seen it before, sorry, I'm doing it again. But it's public data, so we can talk about it. So we aim to be very collaborative in our approach. We're one little company. If we want to reprocess mine waste, there's the holder of that mine waste, the owner of it. We want to collaborate with them. In some cases, that might be the government. But this piece of work was a collaboration between the Geological Survey of Queensland, the Sustainable Minerals Institute at UQ, Chenova Resources, who own Osborne, and Cobalt Blue. So very collaborative, lots of people involved. We took a sample, and the idea was just to demonstrate that it is possible to get, minerals out of, critical minerals in this case, out of mine waste. So we know that there's cobalt in the tailings at Osborne. They've done lots of studies on that. We ran two different flow sheets. The top one is just a conventional flotation and then pressure oxide leach, whereas the bottom one is going through, taking the pyrite and going through a kiln and converting it to pyrrhotite. So in terms of boosting recoveries for pyrite in particular, that is the key, taking it, we don't want to use pyrite. It's too hard it's not reactive enough. It's too hard to break down in a traditional sort of leach step. So turn it into pyrrhotite and then it works. So that's just showing the difference between those two things. All right. Whoops. One that I can talk about is our work at the Flin Flon tailings site in Manitoba, Canada. Flin Flon is a cartoon character from early last century, and there's a statue of him, this crazy little man in the centre of town at Flin Flon. That is an aside because it's a silly name, but the site is owned by Hudbay Minerals, who approached us over a year ago to look at the potential for Cobalt Blue's process to extract elemental sulfur from the mine tailings at Flin Flon. So for them, it was all about sulfur extraction because the mine has closed. It closed about 3 years ago, but before then it operated on and off under various companies for around about 100 years. It's a copper zinc deposit, so that was mainly what it produced. But of course, as we know, nothing's ever pure. There was a bunch of other stuff in there, but that's what production was focused on. That there are now 2 tailings dams, one's hidden by these documents, but 2 tailings dams with between them over 100 million tonnes of sulfur-bearing waste in a very wet, water-rich environment in as Canada tends to be out on the prairies. And the other aspect is that Hudbay has a very large and very long-lived environmental bond on this site. So they're no longer earning money because it's no longer operating, but they've got all this money locked up and the term of that bond is 100 years. So it's, you know, every jurisdiction is a little bit different. In Canada, there's a term for the length of time that Hudbay is responsible for that site, and it's 100 years. So by demonstrating that we can extract elemental sulfur, which is a byproduct of Cobalt Blue's process, what Hudbay and us hope to do is show the potential for desulfidation or desulfidization, however we say it, of this style of acid-forming legacy site, not just here, but around the world, because this isn't an isolated case. The process would, of course, generate some valuable copper, zinc, silver, and also gold credits, but it's going to produce that sulfur prill as a saleable product as well. It's a low value saleable product, but all of those things can be taken off-site, go to a market somewhere else. So we can generate value, but the big kicker for the company is the dramatic reduction in the liability that they hold over that site. So we're currently working through an assessment of the results of the test work that we ran last year and starting to talk about what a potential remining operation might look like. So that's still a work in progress. I don't expect anybody to read this, but in any mining development story, it's no longer about, when we're making a mine, it's no longer about how cool the rocks are and what kind of goodies are in them. It comes down to economics. How much money can a company make out of that deposit? There are great stories for tailings reprocessing operations that have been a great success, and there are many more which are less well known and less well publicised that have been not very successful at all. The concept that something is low grade, but it's not going to work if you're going to reprocess it using the same techniques as the first time around, unless they've really stuffed it up the first time around. But that's, you know, giving credit to all the smart people that work in our industry. That's relatively rare. Yes, technologies have improved and that kind of thing, but ultimately it doesn't really make a good business case to go to low-grade gold mine tailings and say, well, the gold price has gone up, we can go and reprocess these tailings, because we're just talking about lower and lower grade material, and you get to the point where it's, you know, borderline economic and then just not economic at all. So we need to change how to get a mine waste reprocessing operation off the ground, and for it to be considered economic, we need to take a leaf out of Hud Bay's book and look at their concern was the economic burden of that environmental liability, rather than, oh, we've got some stuff in the tailings, can we make some money out of it? They weren't looking at it as a traditional mining operation. They were looking at it from the lens of, we have this liability, what can we do to actually reduce that? So that changes the bar a little bit. And of course, you know, in terms of just other value, there's we can sing songs about ethical metal extraction, green credits associated with improved environmental outcomes, and we are seeing that active now, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But ultimately, it still comes down to how much does something cost in order to make it happen. Now, this was meant to have, because I didn't realise we were PDFing, so I realised it had an animation in it anyway. So I'll talk you through it anyway. On the left-hand side, that's where we're starting. You know, that's our traditional kind of viewpoint of how to make an operation get up and going. We define a resource. You know, we say, yes, we've found some stuff. It's going to be worth this much. Then the engineers come along and go, well, actually, it might be worth that much in ground, but the cost of mining, the cost of processing, CapEx, OpEx, blah, 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 all these, you know, that's the point of a feasibility study. It's in that word, feasibility. Is it feasible? Might be in the ground, but is it feasible to get it out and make money? So we have a negative and a positive, you know, negative costs, so much it costs, the sale of the metals, we can make some money. Very simple. That tells us about the economics of a traditional project. Now for mine waste, we're actually starting from a negative position already in most cases. If you're the owner of that mine waste site, then you already have a big negative number on your books. If you want to come in and buy a legacy site because you think that, you know, you're hot stuff and you can make this tailings reprocessing operation work, but you're still starting from a negative point, because you've got to assume the liability, whether you're assuming it from a government agency or from another company. So in every way you look at it, you're starting from behind. So mine waste reprocessing doesn't actually make a lot of sense when you think about it that way. But if you are like a Hud Bay, you own this big site, you've done all you've operated it for decades, you've made a lot of money, that's all nice. Now it's closing. We've got this big liability. What can we do? So the positives to make that liability smaller, can we do anything to make the acid mine drainage risk less? So can we bring that number up a little bit? Can we reduce the volume of that material? Those are the two things that are going to impact your liability calculations the most. I'm not saying that reprocessing sulfide waste will reduce volume, because it won't, not by, you know, more than a couple of %, not enough to affect your liability, but the reduction in the acid forming potential will. Other people may then look at, you know, taking that more inert sulfide-free material and using it for construction purposes, or, you know, there's all sorts of people doing really clever things with those more sort of, you know, silicate gangue minerals. So working collaboratively with different partners to not only reduce the acid forming potential, but then potentially reducing the volume as well, is going to make a big difference to that liability. And then you can look at the other side and say, what's the cost and how much money can we make? And how does that balance against how much we're going to improve that negative standpoint? And that's where companies, the big companies that own these very, very large sites, and they're the ones that can afford to have those giant liabilities on their books, then they start to go, actually, it doesn't even need to make that much money. It needs to reduce our risk exposure enough to make it worthwhile. So that's what I mean by taking a non-traditional view of the economics of mine waste reprocessing. All right. So acid reduction. I've talked a bit about how cobalt blue makes elemental sulfur as a byproduct. I have given this talk to a few people who are very non-technical, so I know that you're all very smart people and you understand how taking out the sulfide minerals will reduce the risk of acid mine drainage or the potential for acid mine drainage. But just to highlight it again, there are two steps in the cobalt blue flow sheet where we're producing elemental sulfur. So the first one is where we're converting it from pyrite to pyrrhotite during that calcine phase, and we capture that. And the second step is as a residue out of the leach. And it's mixed up together then, but we can separate them out, and it's in a benign hematite and elemental sulfur leach residue. So all of the products of this process have been designed to not be harmful in the environment, to reduce the amount of liability that the company will hold after processing and mining is finished. I've already shown you this slide, but I just wanted to come back to remind you, number one, of the scale of the funds that are tied up in environmental bonds in Australia, which, as I said before, I think is actually woefully underestimated, particularly WA, but we won't say that too out loud. Sorry for the WA people online. I think the Mine Rehabilitation Fund is not very good. But these bonds are still, even though they're low, even though they're an underestimate, they are still a significant financial burden on the companies hoping to progress a primary mining development, or to take on the liability of a pre-existing site. And when we come up with when the government, they've got a bunch of different estimator spreadsheets and stuff, you can look up each state, see how they calculate their environmental bonds. And for sulfide mines, a significant proportion of that bond is tied up in how much acid forming material are you going to be making and then storing in a mine waste site. So I know the writing is very small, and you can have copies of the talk as PDF later or whatever, but the New South Wales spreadsheet was particularly good because you could play around with the numbers, and I'm sure the others are as well, but that was the one that I went through first. And there are some good examples of if you're in the highest category for acid forming potential, then it's an order of magnitude more than if you're in the lowest category for acid forming potential. So it was like the difference of $82,000 per hectare versus $820,000. Like it was a massive difference. So you extrapolate that out across a much larger volume, and it really does make a big difference. So challenges for mine waste reprocessing. It's not all, we're going to save the world and do lots of green mining and everyone's going to love us. It does represent a fantastic opportunity. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that, but it does come with some pretty significant challenges. The biggest hurdle, without a doubt, is the scale of liability for abandoned or closed mines in particular, but also for operating mines as a junior wanting to come in and reprocess. So environmental bonds are a necessity. They are there to protect communities and natural habitat from poor management by mining companies, and they're based on some pretty nasty things that have occurred in the past. But the majority of the players in this space who are wanting to come in and make a business model around reprocessing mine waste are juniors, right? They can't actually afford the scale of these bonds. So, New Century is a good example. When they've been bought by Sibanye now, but when they started out, they had to have MMG basically as the seller of Century Mine act as a guarantor on the loan because to take on that liability, because the size of the loan size of the bond far exceeded their market cap, and no lending organisation, no bank would lend them that money with a risk profile that exceeded their value as a company. So that's a reality. It's an economic reality for juniors wanting to reprocess mine waste. So we don't all have MMG as our best friends. What else can we do? So it's working with governments, working with the big companies. But I was in a meeting with one very big company the other day saying, well, and somebody else in the meeting was like, well, why don't I'll call it out because it was Rio actually, but somebody else in this meeting was saying, well, why don't you guys, you're the ones that own such and such a site, why don't you reprocess the material if there's that many goodies in it? And Mel Stutzel's like, well, our mandate is tier 1 deposits, and a mine waste facility doesn't meet all of the characteristics of a tier 1 global deposit. So we don't want to do it, but we'll help somebody else to make it happen. So that's why she was in the meeting. So it needs to be a very collaborative space. And that also needs to include collaboration with governments, because whilst we're talking about company-owned sites, there are also a huge number, thousands and thousands of abandoned sites where the local state government or around the world, whatever the case may be, own the liability and own the responsibility for that site. So how do we overcome that hurdle without sending the companies that want to come in and do something about it broke? The next challenge is regulatory frameworks for the mining industry have been designed around traditional primary mining operations. So they failed in the current form to adequately support and promote many of the remining operations, particularly where, in the case of abandoned mines, the mining licenses have lapsed. So I've come most recently out of government. I'm back in industry now, so I can, I've had conversations on both sides. There is a huge amount of enthusiasm within government agencies for the concept, but execution is not there yet. This is the framework that we have to operate in, and it's too hard to change the Mining Act, or it's too, blah, blah, blah. Some jurisdictions have found ways around this, but it's usually on a site-by-site approach. So Tasmania has introduced a number of site-specific special acts to encourage the reopening of closed mines to process harmful acid mining waste, like Mount Lyell, a few others are good examples. In Queensland, here, the Department of Resources and the Office of Mine Rehabilitation Commissioner have proposed the introduction of a new type of mining tenure, specifically for waste reprocessing, but the details of how that works in reality haven't really, at the moment it's conceptual. And then in the US, a number of sites are being examined under the Good Samaritan Act, which I thought was really interesting, with the idea that those who are acting to improve environmental outcomes, and obviously only not-for-profit agencies could qualify for this, but if you're working with friends of, you've got a collaboration with a not-for-profit, then it might qualify. But because the idea is that you're not making a profit, you're just acting for the good of the environment. So then you don't have to hold the liability of those sites. So that's being trialled over in the US. Next challenge, I alluded to it before, most tailings dams are very low grade when they are compared to their primary ore body. So, the first round of processing was designed to extract that primary 1 or 2 commodities, applying, again, coming back to the economics, applying the same economic lens as the traditional mining operation means that these opportunities won't get off the ground because they're too low grade. But by considering the reduction in liability, the reduction in a need for ongoing environmental management due to improved environmental outcomes, can help change the economics, as can the potential for a green premium or a green credit developing those projects. And you know, it's something that's been a little bit in the media with the nickel market in particular recently. Why can't Australia claim a green nickel credit? Well, that's different to, and you know, working through the LME or all those different organisations setting the global prices of stuff. That's a slow burn. Maybe it'll get there, maybe it won't. But we're already seeing individual consumers, and I'm talking specifically Apple and a jeweler called Majuri. Again, this meeting that Rio Tinto happened to be in, there was the vice president of something for Apple and these jewelry people partnering with Regeneration Enterprises, which Cobalt Blue is a partner with as well. Both of those companies, and Apple is one of the biggest companies in the world, both of those companies are in there in that meeting because they specifically want to source metals for their products. They know they can't necessarily, you know, for a phone, they can't necessarily do everything, but they can at least try to source some components that they require from somewhere that they feel that they have control over, they have pure visibility over, and they're cleaning up the environment in the process of getting those metals. So both of those companies are paying a premium for that metal. Majuri, this jeweler, and we're not talking about critical minerals, we're talking about gold, but they are releasing a line of earrings in the next few months. And the gold has specifically come from a series of placid gold sites that are being rehabilitated whilst we're getting the metals out as part of the regeneration thing. So you'll be, and the little earrings will be branded, you know, blah, 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 blah. So there are companies that are paying more than the market value in order to be able to say, I want that thing. It's like when we go out and buy a BMW versus a, you know, 1970s Holden or something. I'm not a car person. But if you say, well, I want the luxury version, I don't want the Kia Sorento, I want the BMW i40, blah, blah, blah. You're going to pay more for that because you want these particular requirements, and companies are starting to apply that in market. It's not, you know, on the London Metal Exchange, but it's in specific company-to-company transactions. And then finally, I know I've waffled on, tailings dams, the metallurgy, challenging metallurgy. Tailings dams and other forms of mine waste have very, very challenging metallurgy, much more than the primary deposit in many cases, because this material has already been through a processing plant. Whatever is in the tailings dam was too hard to extract the first time. Using the same technology won't work necessarily. It'll be disappointing. And now the tailings material has been exposed to air, crushed up, it's becoming oxidized, material's wet, there's water everywhere in a lot of cases. And it's a very bioactive environment. So there's a lot of bacteria promoting and enabling biochemical activity of a lot of the minerals, or reactivity of the minerals. So everything's changing, and it's going to be different from the top of the tailings dam right down to the bottom. So how you deal with all of those variations in one flow sheet is going to be pretty tricky. Maybe you need a series of flow sheets, but whatever you do, it's a metallurgical problem rather than a geological one. So having said all that, I really don't think that these challenges can't be overcome. Opportunities are there to be realised if industry and government can work together, and I think it's that particular collaboration that's needed to overcome, you know, liability and regulatory challenges. But there's benefit then not just to individual mine sites and supply chains, but local communities, local environments, all of that sort of thing. There's a lot of flow-on goodness, and it just takes a bit of collaboration and innovation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I'll ask for questions in a moment. First of all, Thanks for that fantastic talk and explaining where Flin Flon came from. I always had questions about that one. That was good. Before I hand it on to Mark, I'll get my question in first because then I won't get one. And I'll ask the people at home if they start rapidly typing their questions, if they have any. Question I had was obviously you're dealing with existing tailings dams, which may have something that previously wasn't of interest. So, okay,
Yep.
it may well be economic. But there may also be nasty things in there, as
Yes.
you mentioned, the centipoid and
Yep.
a whole bunch of other nasty things. Presumably, you need to build another tailings dam to process
Yes.
the
Yeah.
tailings. Is that more of a challenge, given the sites may already be constrained?
Potentially. It's going to, like site by site, you'll have different scenarios. So at Century, they're putting the tailings back into the old pit.
Mhm.
So if it's an abandoned site and you do have that ability, then that's,
Yep.
you know, or into underground or whatever, you know, there's that, that as an option. One of the companies that I've been talking to in Spain is they're coming to the end of life of one of their tailings dams, and in the next couple of years they will be, you know, they've got all the approvals in place for the next one. So then that's a good window of opportunity to say, well, we can reprocess that, like, and it's a live operation. We can reprocess that tailings without interfering with the way you're working, to then and the new material can go into the new tailings as well. But it's another part of that regulatory burden of how do we then manage, you know, you've got to disturb the material in order to do something with it. So then what do you do? Yeah.
It worked for Cowtails and they made a lot of money. I'll pass this on to Mark, who always is at the other end of the room.
Thank you, Helen. Excellent presentation. I've actually got two questions for you.
Okay.
The first question is that every tailings reprocessing operation that I'm aware of is reprocessing the tailings to extract the primary metals that were originally targeted. Are you aware of any operations, tailings reprocessing operations, that are actually recovering something other than was originally targeted in the program, in the original mining?
Not very many, but there's a few kind of in development. So you'll see more about those, I guess, whether it's Cobalt Blue or other companies in the future. But one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Rio aluminium thing in Canada, and they're getting scandium out of the waste. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that leads on to my second question. So the opportunity that you talk about tonight has been well established for a very long time. You know, most people in the industry totally are aware of what the potential opportunities are, but we haven't yet been able to grasp and actually take advantage of those opportunities. You mentioned a number of factors there. You've got difficulties, you've got difficult metallurgy. When it comes to the cobalt focus, which is your company's focus, in your experience so far, are the key issues in getting this to be economic more a financial cost basis, or are they more a process basis issue?
I would say both. And again, it's going to be different depending on where you are. Costs could be much less than a primary mining operation if all the infrastructure, power and water is still there. So the site wasn't closed very long ago. So you don't have to do a lot of, you know, there's not a lot in CapEx. Whereas if it's in a fully abandoned site, you know, and people have sold off the bits and pieces to try and, you know, the receivers have been and gutted the place, then, you know, that might be harder. For us though, and I want to say that even though our name is Cobalt Blue and cobalt is the focus of the Broken Hill project and the refinery, for mine waste reprocessing, Flin Flon has no cobalt in it whatsoever. It'll be a, it'll be a gold project actually, more than anything. So it doesn't, we don't really care about the commodity. It's more around where can we apply processing? Where are the most suitable sites that will work with our flow sheet, or, that we can tweak to get that. So I think having a team of really smart metallurgists in the company, we're not an exploration company really. We've got an exploration team of 1 and then a metallurgy team of 5 or 6. So it's the challenge, but we've sort of said, as part of our strategy, we would like to take on metallurgically challenging projects because we think that's where our strength lies. And if you can do that economically, then, you're solving some long-standing problems. But yeah.
Helen, in terms of Cobalt Blue's current plan of building the refinery in WA, what's the balance of how much material you're going to put through that, or versus, there's a distance issue of how far you can bring material that's economic, or is that a development place?
So initially the refinery is being designed to take third-party feed from sources mainly in WA. And it'll be a I think it's 3,500 tonnes per annum initially on that third-party feed, and then when the Broken Hill project comes online, noting that that's in a pause, because of the cobalt price, then we'll up the volume capacity for the refinery to then take material from, and we'll be shipping it as MHP from Broken Hill by rail to WA.
Right. Just a simple little question. I saw a talk, who's the guy at Nexus? Interesting talk where he said the single biggest deposit in Australia is Mount Isa's tailings dam.
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that true?
Yeah. Pretty sure that's true.
So what are you doing?
Well, the tailings team at Glencore gave a talk on Friday about the work that they've been doing to realise opportunities on the tailings dam. So we'll see what they do.
Hi, Helen. Thanks so much for a really good talk. It's sort of a lead on a little bit from what Mark was just saying, and something that you definitely said. And it's interesting. Obviously, grade is a problem, right? But then grade is always obviously a result of whatever's happening economically or whatever's happening technologically in the world. So there's something that we can't necessarily predict, although we can be potentially a little bit savvy about it. I suppose the thing that I really got out of that is that maybe there's a responsibility for all the budding young geologists listening or here, and for any exploration people, is that we've sort of got a responsibility maybe to make sure that we gather as much information as we can at the beginning of any sort of project or exploration project. And thanks to our partners of ALS, they're obviously making these, like the geochemistry side of things. Oh, thanks so much. They're making that, yeah. They're making that cheaper. So getting our full element suites when we're doing these sort of analysis is an important part for a company to de-risk themselves, or potentially to add value when it comes to a junior selling or anyone sort of selling this on. So I suppose it's something that's important for us to consider, because obviously in the past, people restricting their analysis to very particular elements. So in terms of, like Mark was saying, is there anything else available? That's always going to be an aspect of, do you know what's actually there to even look in the first place? So I don't know if you've got any comment on
I'm just, as you're talking, thinking about one of the juniors that I used to work for, where there was a mandate of, only sample the ore zone, had to argue for the wings on either side of the ore zone, and it's going to be like these 5 elements, and I cringe to think of what might have been missed. But when I was at GSQ, one of the big programs that we had was to understanding that, data collected in the 50s wasn't to modern standards. There was that tendency to sample only these bits and only do a much smaller suite of elements, or, and even now, because the company I'm talking about, that was only 7 or 8 years ago. So I think then there's the opportunity for geological surveys to be going back. They've got these huge drill core collections going back and reanalyzing a lot of that historical core. It doesn't have to be everything, but just representative material from, from key deposits and that kind of thing to give everybody some idea. It's enough to then give companies the impetus to go out and do more sampling of their own or whatever. But so that project, is I don't know, 5 or 6 years in now in terms of resampling and reanalyzing core all the copper explorers. Did they analyze for cobalt? Some of them did, some of them didn't, 30 years ago.
Considering the cost of analysis now, I mean, it's sort of incumbent on the industry as well to take that up, because it shouldn't have to go back to reworking, because that's more energy, more effort. And so in terms of trying to be greener, it's a better way to do it, to just get it done at the
first time around. And there's a lot of non-destructive techniques, PXRF and that kind of thing. You can get way better analyses now than you used to be able to. Maybe.
I might add a comment to that last piece.
Just whatever.
So, one of the best ways to generate value now, if you've got a project that you're drilling out and you're planning on mining it, is to know where all the blocks are going to go. And you can actually generate tens of millions of dollars of value by making sure you characterize your waste correctly.
Yep.
So there's actually a value proposition in there that is very difficult to sell still though, because you're selling a cost up front, and no one wants to spend the money now. They'd rather spend it in 20 years' time. So that's what you're up against there. But my actual question was, what's your cutoff grade for cobalt in a tailings dam before you get interested?
What is the motivation of the company to reduce their liability, and what else is in there? Flin Flon, the cutoff grade will be just about 0.
So I guess in terms of process, if you're treating it as an exploration issue, right? When would someone get interested enough to actually want to know if they want to go sample a tailings dam and work out if there's value there?
Yeah, Mike. if it was up to me, I'd sample everything. But yeah, I mean, most people will know, like Mark said earlier, most people know what's there, even if there's not a great data set on cobalt in the old copper mine or the nickel mine. It's not part of the resource model, et cetera, et cetera. They'll have somebody at some point will have done a more fulsome analysis, even if it was only a tiny bit. And you go, oh, that's enough to be interesting. So talking to the geos and saying we'd be interested in, looking at your tailings. Can we do some more analyses? We still need to, I think for a tailings dam, it is an exploration project in a way. We still need to go and drill it out. You still need to characterize all the material. You still need to understand what's there. So I haven't answered your question at all, because like I said, Cobalt Blue is not looking for cobalt in mine waste. We're looking for mineralogies that are amenable to a particular flow sheet.
Fair enough.
There's a question down the front here as well.
Yeah,
oh, hang on.
Sorry. I have a follow-on question.
Oh, okay.
So you guys have all been talking about what I would describe as how you do target generation to figure out which tailings dams to characterize. But then they go through a bunch of deposition processes. Then you started touching on it then. What does characterization look like? What is the defined step of the process? What are you seeing people do in terms of applying tech to that bit?
So obviously there aren't a set of criteria under JORC like there would be for, a more conventional resource development story. But we're essentially talking about a man-made sedimentary deposit. So it'll have been, like Simon was talking before about when we were downstairs, talking about mapping out the history of movement of the hoses depositing, and I'm sort of, when I think about it, it's like it's a fan, like a delta kind of deposit coming out of this hose and onto this brick patch. So taking some of those facies models and sedimentary kind of stratigraphy models, which I'm not a sedimentologist, so I never you know, I learnt them and forgot them straight away at uni, but that's the kind of geology model that you would apply, I think. But you still need to, even if it's wider space than for, you know, a nuggety gold deposit or something, you have a wide spaced drill program and you do your comprehensive assays, but then mineralogy is one of the key things. It's not just geochemistry, it's got to be that mineralogy as well, because it's a metallurgy story. But the Canadian, you know, the TSX, the ASX, the various organisations are yet to develop a standard for reporting resources on tailings dams. So sometime soon, 10 or 20 years, I don't know. Simon's shaking his head. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's something in the front, yeah.
So I'm just now swapping my minerals industry hat with my citizen of the state hat,
Okay.
and following up on some of the comments made earlier today. All the minerals that we mine are owned by the state.
Yes.
And it's very clear that, in my opinion, as a citizen of the state, that the state has a responsibility to ensure that mining companies do the right thing that benefits the overall community. And it's very clear that the state governments in every state of Australia have allowed mining companies to get away with murder and have not extracted commodities to the most appropriate way that benefits the state as a whole. They've always allowed companies to get away with extracting the minerals of choice and the best of them and leave the crap in the ground that some other company has to deal with. So it's really just an observation. In my mind, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today could be resolved if the state actually instituted much more stringent controls on exploration and mining. So that's just my observation.
I think that we do need to change how we go forward with new operations. So designing in that efficiency and full value proposition at the start, but then we're still left with all this legacy. So, you know, we can say from this point forward, we'll do X, Y, Z, but for everything in the past, we've still got to then go back and deal with it as well. Yeah. No, but I agree. We should be far more efficient with our mining.
Are you okay for another question?
Yeah. That's fine. I've still got bear.
Steptoe and Sons came up with there is money in muck. I think one of your jobs is to try to, I may be saying so, convince people that there is real money in muck. Let's go to a little bit further on in the processing system, and we're taking out the metals. We're taking out sulfur. Is there anything else there?
Yes. Yeah.
Now that has to be looked at, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I'm looking at a brick wall at the moment. It's a very pretty brick wall, but there is a shortage of materials that you make bricks out of in Australia and the world.
There's a group making
Can there
bricks out of mine
so-
waste. Yeah.
Please.
Sorry,
yeah.
I interrupted you. There is a group trialling making bricks out of mine waste. It's
Yes.
in WA.
Cold fusion.
I'm not sure how they do it, but I know that they're doing it.
Yes.
And we are planning to run some of our leach residue through that just to make a couple of bricks and see how it works. But one of the points of discussion on that is that, again, you don't want to spend a huge amount of money transporting things from very far away, particularly when they're not worth a lot. So it works well in, say, the case of Broken Hill. You've got a population centre there, and providing you do have growth and the need for new building materials, then it's close by and you can sell that construction material, whether it's the bricks out of the leach residue or it's then, you know, the more silicate material, you know, for use in cement or various other things.
Road aggregates for the future.
Well, EQ Resources is up in Mount Carbine in North Queensland. They are working with Transport and Main Roads to sell some of their waste as road aggregate. So yes, no, good point, but yeah, there are people, there are bits and pieces of action in places. It's not a wholesome effort yet.
Very last question.
Yeah.
All right, second very last question.
This is following on from Mark's comment as a citizen of the state. I would also say that the mining industry at least has a database of its waste. I defy the plastics industry to have any indication of where their waste is, and the agricultural industry as well.
All right, that was a statement.
I don't work for government anymore. Okay.
Last question? Yep. Very last question.
All right, that's a privilege. My question was just on the value add for procrastination on mine closure, and you mentioned the acid mine drainage issue. And that was interesting. I mean, just a complete hypothetical, if I was a large base metal producer and I had a large rock dump full of pyrite, for instance, that may or may not have caught fire. What would the value add, for instance, be in this sort of technology? I mean, basically reducing the storage and isolation time of a waste rock dump, which is liable to acid mine drainage and combustion issues into the, long foreseeable future. Is that a sort of, I mean, I guess, is there a business case for reprocessing that stuff with the priority being on the reduction of a major environmental issue and a site like that? Hypothetical site like that.
Hypothetically, yes. Again, it depends on the entities involved and what their motivation is, but for most big companies, it is around remediating those either current or future environmental risks. And so that is becoming more and more of a priority. And really it's the more junior end of town that are focused on the metals that we can make. The big end of town is all about liability reduction. So yeah, I think that there is definitely a case for where there is like a clear and present risk and issue. There is then the motivation to do something about it. But it's not like you can just switch it on straight away. It takes a long time to develop an operation. So if it's a currently operating mine, then a current operator doesn't want another company necessarily coming in and interfering with their operation. So it works better if they've closed, and so then a company like Cobalt Blue can come in. Working side by side is then tricky in terms of, site safety, who owns the risk for personnel safety, not just the environmental risk, but then we're talking about, companies working to and people have contractors on sites all the time, but would we come in as a contractor or do we come in as a separate company? Like there's a whole lot of stuff that's a little bit more complex than just, there's a need to fix this environmental problem. So, and then if we needed to build our own plant because what they've got on site is not, we can't use that, then that is a huge amount of money and takes a long time, takes years as well. So it's not necessarily a quick fix. It's a long-term thing rather than a short-term thing. Unless it's close enough to the Broken Hill demonstration plant that we can just drive it there and do it there. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. You've now got the record for the most number of questions.
Oh, wow.
You've done well.
I have no voice left. We didn't even look online.
It will be on.
Sorry.
Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you here in a month's time. Good night all.